This episode is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 26th, 1951. Now, this incident actually took place on December 25th, Christmas Day, in Mims, Florida, which is on the eastern coast of Florida, near actually Cape Canaveral, if you know, sort of east of Orlando. A bomb goes off under the bedroom floor at the home of Harry and Harriette Moore, two local civil rights activists. The explosion killed both of them, and this marks the first assassination of any activist to occur during the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Not to mention the first assassination, I think only assassination, of a husband and wife activist pair. And I should also add that this took place on their 25th wedding anniversary on that day. So, a tragic story and a largely forgotten story, though in recent years the story of the Moores has been resurrected and tied into other stories of the early civil rights movement in interesting ways. So, let's try and resurrect that story, tell that story now. Let's talk about the Moores, their activism, what we know and don't know about that night and their violent death. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
A couple things about this story before we get into the meat of it, but just to jump out at me, and I'm curious. But, you know, one is obviously Christmas Day, which is also their wedding anniversary. Just getting married on Christmas Day is really nice. I mean, I don't know.
It's
very sweet. And the fact that they're a couple with Harry and Harriette are the two in the couple. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just these little details jump out at me. Not that it wouldn't be a tragedy otherwise, but a Harry and a Harriette marrying each other on Christmas Day. Gosh. And then one other thing that I think is important to lay the groundwork, and actually I'm wondering if we can start here. But, you know, in my intro, when I was writing, I was sort of struggling a little bit with this reference to it being the first assassination in the, and sometimes people refer to it as quote unquote modern civil rights movement. You know, this is 51, but like, what is that context? When do we, because I mean, the civil rights movement has existed in this country since, you know, its founding, right? And so what do we make of 1951? Where is a turning point between sort of ongoing civil rights activism and the modern civil rights movement? I mean, what's that context?
That's such a good question, Jody, because this is exactly the kind of thing that historians wrestle with so much. I mean, I think that the common, standard, modern civil rights movement is one that we associate with the 1950s and 60s. Where you start it depends on who you're focused on and what kind of figures you're thinking about, whether it's something like the Montgomery bus boycott or the sit-ins that start in the early 1960s, those kinds of mass political activism that is largely tied to nonviolence and civil disobedience and figures like Martin Luther King Jr. Obviously, this predates that. The NAACP itself is founded, I think, in 1909. So that goes way before this. We've talked about A. Philip Randolph and his activism, and Moore himself, who is getting involved in anti-segregation lawsuits or anti-racist lawsuits as early as the 1930s. And of course, you go back even further, like you said, it goes back to the beginning of the country. So I think that it's right for us to wrestle with that way of thinking about this event, because it singularizes something that has this centuries-long history.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of scholars now, and maybe we've talked about this before, that refer to the civil rights movement as the long freedom struggle. And I think long freedom struggle is just so appropriate because whether you're pinning it to Brown v. Board or the death of Emmett Till, or you're going back to the rape of Recy Taylor, like there are all of these sort of smaller, lesser known stories that could easily be, you know, sort of like galvanizing moments within the movement. And so it really is this long story. But what I think is special about this story is that it sort of puts Florida on a map in a way that I think has been left out of that long freedom struggle. We tend to focus on Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi. And Florida is very much the South. We don't think of it as a southern state per se. It's somewhat like an outlier sometimes in terms of our geography, mental geography. But Florida has had a lot of drama, issues, altercations. The one that sticks out the most to me is the Kissimmee swimming pool, where they put acid in a swimming pool that Black children were swimming in. So this story, I hope us shedding light on it will bring more attention to what Florida was doing at the time.
That's such a great point. And that's what strikes me, too, is that Florida sort of escapes the clutches of the Deep South. Mm-hmm. And yet it was leading in the number of Black lynchings per capita in the 1930s. It was the site where Thurgood Marshall was a little hesitant to intervene because it was such a violent, Klan-infested place. And I think it's important to bring it back into the story because it very much is a Southern state, and it's very much a state where Black activism was necessary, not just to overcome segregation, but to overcome all of this political violence.
Yeah. So a couple things as we start to talk about the Moores and their work. Certainly the Florida-ness of this is interesting. You mentioned Thurgood Marshall, who intersects with this story. We'll get to that in a second. But the other thing, as we kind of think about early civil rights movement, ongoing civil rights movement, long freedom struggle, as you put it, Kellie. So many of these stories, we realize that there's the kind of very public moment of protest, and there was years and years of work leading up to that. And that work was often in the courts, in the schools, so, behind the scenes. And this is very much a story of that. The Moores are people who were fighting the fight largely in schools and then in the courts. And that was their background. They were teachers, first and foremost, right?
Yeah. And one of the first things that they do as early as 1937 is to push back on and create a lawsuit in which Black teachers were not being paid the same salaries or wages as white teachers, and to get basically a law that would make sure that teachers were paid equally no matter what their skin color. And the thing that's interesting about the Moores is that they're pretty successful. I mean, that's what's so shocking about it. It's like, you won your case, I think that we should know more about them, given the fact that they created so many victories for the movement in Florida. But also those victories are what really made them targets because of their success.
Yeah, there's this moment that happens several years later in 1944. The Supreme Court rules that all white primary elections are unconstitutional. They had been used widely throughout the South, and the argument was that, well, parties are private institutions, and therefore the 14th Amendment doesn't touch them, 15th Amendment doesn't touch them. And once the Supreme Court says, well, you can't have all white primaries anymore, Harry Moore goes out and he registers 31% of eligible Black voters in Florida. So over the course of just the next 6 years, he adds 116,000 members to the Florida Democratic Party, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. And that is both impressive work, as Kellie was saying. Like, he is somebody who is a successful activist. He is somebody who is doing that kind of on-the-ground grassroots work. It's very dangerous work. Yeah. I mean, registering Black voters
116,000 of them. That's something game changer in any election.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's something that puts a target on your back.
Right. And so as we map the timeline leading up to their death in 1951, so as we said, in 37, there's this lawsuit about teacher salaries. In 44, they start to move into voter registration. In 46, they get fired from their teaching jobs because of their advocacy, and Harry goes to work for the NAACP full time. And then we get to 1949, which is this incident that I think if people know any part of sort of Florida civil rights history, they probably know this moment. But in 1949, we have the Groveland 4 case, which is a high-profile trial and moment of activism. So what is the Groveland 4, since we haven't done an episode on that? And how does Harry Moore and Harriette Moore and Thurgood Marshall work into that moment?
So this is one of those cases that is going to sound very familiar because it hits many of the same beats that many civil rights cases are going to come up against. These are 4 young Black men who are arrested after a white woman accuses them of rape. And they are beaten by the police pretty badly, and they are very quickly rushed through trial. And there's a sense that like there's not been an investigation. There's been all of these abuses, not just of their civil rights, but of their physical bodies. And Thurgood Marshall gets involved, and one of his people on the ground that he is working with is Harry Moore, to try to provide a defense of the Groveland Four and to try to get them out of custody and out of prison.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
Yeah, Niki's right. There are a lot of cases like this across the South in which individual Black men, but also collective groups of Black men were accused of sexual assault, and that are almost always found guilty rather quickly, without sort of justice having its course. And so in this particular incident, two of the men who were under the care of the sheriff, he was transporting them from, one facility to another, doing their retrial. There's questions of him abusing these men and then also shooting one of the men and killing them. And because of this horrific incident, this is where Harry says, this is unacceptable. We need to push for this sheriff to be suspended from his job. Clearly, he's responsible for the death of this man and for the abuse of the other. And so he's not successful in that. The sheriff manages to maintain his position and his role. But you have to understand the audacity of what it meant to even call for something like that during a time in which everyone expected the status quo to be no one would be held accountable and that these men would all be found guilty.
And that a white sheriff is one of the most dangerous people that you could go up against, because there is a kind of impunity in police departments and sheriff's departments in the South, particularly if you're a Black person. And I think that it's, as we get to kind of the heart of this story, Harry Moore is calling for the suspension of this police officer. The killing of one of the Groveland men happens in November of 1951. Moore then calls for the sheriff to be removed from office. And 6 weeks later, that's when this Christmas bombing happens.
Yeah. Moore is the executive director of the Florida NAACP at this point. His wife, Harriet, is very involved in NAACP activism as well. As you said, Kelly, they have a target on their back. I suppose we should go to the night of the bombing. The bomb, as I said, is placed under their bedroom. It blows up underneath them. It kills... Well, it doesn't kill them instantly. I think one of the big parts of this story is that there is not a hospital that will admit Black patients nearby. And so the two of them have to go much further than they normally would in order to find a hospital in Sanford, Florida, to be treated. And Harry succumbs soon thereafter. His wife lasts a little bit longer, enough to see him buried, and then eventually she dies as well. What else is there about that night that jumps out?
I mean, I can't imagine having my house be bombed and then having to drive basically 30 miles to get to a hospital that would treat me. I'm sure there are neighbors that rallied and got them to the hospital. Certainly they didn't drive themselves, but the fact that there was no place that would accept them just shows you that the whole system is complicit in sort of the violence and the neglect through violence that happens to Black communities.
And I think it's also worth taking a moment to think about what that night was for the Moores, right? Jody, you talked about at the beginning how this was their anniversary. Their daughter was in the house. Their mother, his mother, I think, was visiting. And his mother had been pretty concerned for their safety for very good reason. I mean, so folks who are active in the NAACP in Florida, Harry Moore had been called the most hated Black man in Florida, which makes him the most hated man in Florida. Moore knew that he was in danger or that he was a target, but he also believed in the work that he was doing. And he was like, that's one of the sacrifices that comes with doing the work, is that you are going to be in danger. And so it's a Christmas night. They're all together in this house. And then, as you say, because the bomb was put under their bedroom, they were being explicitly targeted. The explosion kills them. It doesn't injure his daughter, or their daughter, or his mother. But it's a pretty, you couldn't imagine a more placid scene than a home like that on Christmas night. And in fact, when Langston Hughes is going to later write a poem to remember Harry Moore, and he plays with that idea, the imagery of Christmas and this idea of, peace on earth and how it's contradicted by the violence of that night.
And the choice of that night, I think, is, intentional in that it is there to send a message and to strike fear. And, when we talk about the likely suspects here, we talk about what is often referred to as a domestic terrorist organization, the KKK, right? Which takes on these kinds of symbolic terroristic tactics. So what do we know? I mean, I think it is still the case that this is an open case. It is unknown exactly who perpetrated this crime. But what do we know, or what questions seem to still be out there?
Who did it?
Who did it?
Yeah.
There was never anyone who was ever prosecuted for these murders, even though as a cold case it was reopened in the 21st century. It was almost certainly the Klan.
Yeah. High-ranking members of the Klan were sort of implicated, but no one was ever brought to justice. I think there's two rubs here. I think one is the rub that a lot of these cases never have anyone ever brought to justice. And the second rub is that the moment that we're living in right now doesn't really allow you to talk about this story in Florida. I mean, if you're thinking about, what stories would need to be discussed as part of, Florida's civil rights history, do you think the Moors make it into the textbook? I don't think so. And that makes it the violation keeps repeating itself in some sense because it's never allowed to be rectified, let alone discussed.
Right. And I think we've been rightfully casting this as a forgotten story, but in its moment, in its time, I mean, I am struck by the amount of press it did get, the amount of people that showed up at services and protests all the way up to New York, and the NAACP community was rallied around this. I mean, it's not like the Moors were in obscurity at the time, at least.
Yeah.
Not at all. And tens of thousands of people show up for these memorial services that are held. There's one in 1952 at Madison Square Garden. Langston Hughes, I mentioned before, attends. Jackie Robinson holds a memorial service in New York City shortly after. And Harry himself is given a medal for outstanding achievement in 1952, the year after he's died. And I think it's also worth remembering that, at the moment it was hugely important. It does get overshadowed by the movement that follows and the assassinations that follow. But it has in recent years been rediscovered. I mean, there's a really excellent book called Devil in the Grove that tells the story of the Groveland Four, but also talks about the NAACP in Florida and Moore and Marshall and the work that they did to try to bring justice in this case. So I think that importantly, it's back. I think that, as Kellie points out, 2 steps forward or 1 step forward,
Two steps back,
maybe half a step back in this case.
All right. I think we will leave it there, other than to say there have been some more landmarks and some plaques. Their home has a landmark. I believe I saw that there was a park named after them in that part of Florida. So if we have any listeners in that area and you know about this or see a plaque, do let us know. All right. Now, before we go, as always, let's do a little also on this day. So here we are, December 26th. This is the day that we are recording this and the day we're marking. So also on this day, December 26th, in 1908, Jack Johnson became the first black boxer to win the World Heavyweight Championship, defeating Canadian Tommy Burns in Sydney, Australia. We should maybe find a reason to do that at some point. It's a really fascinating story.
Also, it was on Boxing Day.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. Nicely done.
In 1917, during World War I, President Woodrow Wilson issued a proclamation authorizing the government take over the operation of the nation's railroads.
And in 1966, Kwanzaa was celebrated for the first time on this day.
Happy Kwanzaa.
Happy Kwanzaa, all. 1980, Iranian television footage was broadcast in the United States showing a dozen of the American hostages sending messages to their families. I don't think we've done the hostage crisis in any way. We should find a smaller, interesting wrinkle to that.
And in 2006, former President Gerald Ford died in Rancho Mirage, California at the age of 93.
Long-lived guy.
And long-lived guy. Nikki, have you been to the Gerald Ford president? I feel like you're our official presidential
I have
library
not. Every
person.
time I go out to California on presidential business, it's usually Nixon or Reagan. Ford,
That's the story of
was an
Gerald
elected
Ford.
president.
Poor Gerald Ford. Nixon on one side, Reagan on the other. There you go.
Poor Ford.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Those are some also on this days. Again, we're going to be focusing on those in the newsletter, which I see a lot of people are signing up for. So please go and sign up for our newsletter at thisdaypod.com. You can also find more information about how to support our show. You can find transcripts. You can also find a link to our merch store. All sorts of stuff at thisdaypod.com. There's literally, you could fill minutes of your day perusing our website and finding all sorts of interesting things. So, who doesn't need to kill some time at thisdaypod.com? All right, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Well, yeah.
Happy Kwanzaa.
Merry Christmas. Happy Boxing Day.
Happy Boxing Day.
There will be Kwanzaa, so yes, happy Kwanzaa.
All right. If only there were a term that would just capture all of the things you could say in this season.
Happy holidays.
Oh, there it is. All right.
This is Jesus erasure.
Yeah.
If I understand the culture wars correctly.
Oh, gosh. While we're doing this, if we're doing this, we might as well say there is still out there that multi-part series we did on the history of the war on Christmas, which is still very valid and worth listening to. And we'll send that out on social. But, you can go listen to that if you haven't either. But anyway, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays. And we'll see you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia. From